Okay, it appears to be live. All right. So hello and welcome to our Ask Me Anything interview with Dr. Ashok Goel, hosted by the Interactive AI magazine. This is actually our third AMA in the series. You can go to interactiveaimag.org to find the others. And today we have Dr. Goel, Professor of Computer Science and Human-Centered Computing in the School of Interactive Computing at Georgia Tech. Also Chief Scientist with Georgia Tech Center for the 21st Century Universities. And Executive Director of, I think it's the new NSF National AI Institute for Adult Learning and Online Education, also known as ALOE, A-L-O-E. And I think I should throw in, because I'm sure you have a lot of students that have experienced this, developed Jill Watson, a virtual teaching assistant for answering students' questions in discussion forums and online classes. And just quickly, I'm Dr. Joshua Ackroth, Associate Professor of Computer Science at Stetson University in Central Florida, and Chief Architect at I2K Connect, who runs AI Topics, for example, and Associate Editor of Interactive AI Magazine. Dr. Goel, welcome.
Thank you,
You definitely got a lot of responses with this request for questions. So like I was just telling you a minute ago, I had to sort of summarize and group them. And honestly, they're all pretty deep questions. So I don't know of a better way to start really than just saying what most excites you right now about AI and what most concerns you.
Good question to begin with.
Yeah.
I think AI has enormous potential for social good. Our world, our society has many problems, climate change being one of them, education, healthcare, and we need new ways of thinking, new solutions. And AI, I think, almost surely will be part of the mix. All of these problems are so big that technology alone cannot address any one of them. But technology will be a major part of it, and AI will be a major part of the technology. And that's just enormously exciting. What a golden moment to be in part of AI. On the other hand, with those benefits also come some serious risks that AI, everyone in AI is talking about. Some of the risks are well known, risks about trustworthiness, for example, risk about bias. And there's also, I think, the risk that sometimes we might not know what problems to address using AI and what problems not to address. Some things are best left alone. So deciding which problems are suited for AI and which problems are best left to other kind of technologies or other forces, social, cultural, political, economic, is a very difficult question, to which I don't have a complete answer, but I sense it as a problem there.
Well, you might not have a complete answer, but surely you've thought about this. So what may be a problem that AI should not address?
Consider education, for example. It's an area in which I work. There are clear examples in which AI has been helpful. And there are clear examples in which AI, despite all of its efforts, has not been very helpful. And perhaps also areas where AI could cause some problems. So an example of where AI could cause problems is it could increase the digital divide. Within the country, there are many people who do not have even the benefit of the internet. And if you look at education across the world, then about half the world does not have access to affordable, reliable internet. So when we talk about using AI technologies, let's say for online education, well, it sounds very good if you have access to an internet and you can access online education. So that is the kind of situation where AI unintentionally, inadvertently, can end up increasing the digital divide in our society and across the world. There are additional problems. We know that, for example, that almost all models of learning, including use of AI in learning, have been developed for certain demographic populations. We don't yet know whether they are robust generalizations. Will they generalize across different demographics? Probably not. And yet here we are in AI saying that AI technology works for this task, for this group, and therefore we can generalize it without knowing whether in fact robust generalization is possible or not. That's where AI can create huge problems potentially.
Did you see any of that inability to adjust to other populations with, for example, your Jill Watson research?
So far we have used Jill Watson mostly at Georgia Tech. So the demographics has been very uniform. And we can share a little bit later about why we are still limited to Georgia Tech and why we have not gone across it. But this summer we are going to introduce it in the technical college system of Georgia. And that has a very, very different demographics. So that will be the first time we'll be sort of challenging Jill Watson in terms of a complete change in demographics, as well as a complete change in the kinds of courses she will be dealing with.
I remember a presentation about increasing representation of women in computer science, and one of the advice given was, you don't just make your curriculum pink. That's not how this works. So what do you plan to do, or have you thought about it yet, to make Jill Watson appropriate for the greater demographics that you're going to address?
That's a very good question. In fact, there was early on a problem that occurred in using Jill Watson. So we had developed Jill Watson initially for the Georgia Tech Online Masters of Science in Computer Science program. It's a very successful program now. There are more than 12,000 students enrolled in it, the largest online program, certainly in the United States, perhaps one of the largest in the world, and it's still growing. But in this particular program, the male to female ratio is highly skewed. So initially, when the program started, it was more like 80% men and 20% women. Now the proportion has balanced a little bit. It's perhaps more like 65% men and 35% women, but still skewed in favor of men. So around 2017, I think it was, that we noticed that Jill Watson was performing in a slightly odd manner, which initially surprised us. So a female student said, let me make sure I remember it right. First, a male student in one semester said, my wife and I are expecting a baby, and I may need to take a couple of weeks off during the middle of the semester. And Jill Watson responded by saying something like, well, we are very happy and welcome to the new addition to your family. And then a semester later, a female student said something, I'm pregnant, I'll be taking 3 weeks off or something in the middle of the semester. And Jill Watson said, well, thank you for letting us know. Welcome to the class. And nothing about welcome to the new addition to the family, which sort of surprised us and puzzled us. So that's an example where there is a small little differentiation coming in the way Jill Watson is dealing. And the reason when we looked into it was that there had been previous questions that male students had asked about, because of the skewed demographic distribution, many more questions coming from male students about someone, they're expecting a baby. There had never been a question where a female student had said, I'm pregnant. And therefore, Jill Watson did not know how to respond to it. It did the best it could. But because it was a new question, it didn't quite know how to respond to it and ignored the part about the pregnancy. So that's a very simple, small example of how, without any intention, we introduce AI agents that can then create biases just because the data is so biased, because the distribution or demographic is biased. Well, we had to stop that particular line of research on Jill Watson because, of course, this was unacceptable. And we moved. So initially, when we built Jill Watson, we already had a library of questions students had asked and answers that human TAs had given. Those question-answer pairs was what we trained Jill Watson on. But now it was clear that the data was very biased. We could have curated it, but that requires a lot of work. Instead, we shifted to Jill Watson answering questions based on unbiased documents or relatively unbiased documentations like class syllabi or course materials, which do not have the same kind of biases, at least we don't think they do. And that has worked out very well. So that particular problem of bias has gone away.
It's fascinating you were able to isolate that case because it's essentially a microaggression and subtle, Someone actually did ask about data and big data. Specifically, what's the impact of the big data that we have these days on things like cognitive science, cognitive systems?
Huge impact. In fact, you mentioned that we have a new NSF-sponsored National AI Institute for Adult Learning and Online Education. And the premise of that institute has to do with big data. Um, on one side, online education lacks some of the affordances that in-person education have. You and I are both professors, so we know that in person, you can make eye contact, you can look at facial expressions of your students. There is a kind of a physical intimacy where they are sitting 10 feet away from you, and there is a connection that goes with it between the teacher and the learner. That connection is lost to some degree in online education. Also, it's not just between the teacher and the learner. The learner themselves has a physical and social connection in a physical classroom, and that connection is lost to a degree in online education. So the question then becomes, well, if we know that in online education some affordances are missing, then how can we really scale up online education and yet keep the quality of online education on par with in-person education? And that connects with the question you were raising. The answer is data, data, data. So one thing that online education offers is huge amounts of data, all the way down from clickstream data to data about assessments, to data about learning progressions and learning trajectories, which can be compared and with normative progressions and normative trajectories. And we can identify where exactly an individual learner is struggling or doing well and adjust the learning and the teaching accordingly. So the hope is that we can use that data to change the way both pedagogy and andragogy occur, so that the quality of learning becomes on par with with in-person education, even though the affordances are changing.
I just want to remind people watching, we do have live watchers. You can ask a question in the chat and we'll probably get to it. I was just thinking though about your answer about big data and education and so on. With COVID, I mean, I definitely had the experience that a lot of people had recently as teachers, switching to online and then switching back. And it is a dramatic change. Like you said, you miss all these affordances, and the professor, the teacher, you feel like you're talking to a wall, like you have no feedback. It's just a screen and usually don't see people. So that makes it very difficult. Now in the classroom, because Stetson's very, kind of adamant about getting students back in the classroom because that's our value add as a small liberal arts school. Now I get to actually walk around and see what students are doing. And they probably won't even bring it up in class, even though we're physically present. I need to go see. So I can definitely understand what you're saying about the affordances. Now I wonder, we see this kind of feedback with SATs and other kinds of tests. Not everybody is really good at those kinds of tests. It kind of depends on your background. Do you find that with online learning that the same thing can happen? There are I wouldn't say kinds of people, but groups of people that are good at online learning and groups that aren't. And do you think this extra data, is it the right kind of data? Is that going to help that issue?
That's a very good point. I expect that online learning will suit some learners more than others. So let's go back to Georgia Tech OMSCS example, which is a very successful example. Why is it so successful? Could all online learning be equally successful? Now, there are many reasons for the success of that program, but at least one of the reasons is that the students it's attracting are not your typical 22-year-olds or 18-year-olds or 24-year-olds. The median age is 38. These are people who have been working. So this is not the first skill they are learning. This is the second or third skill they are learning. Because they are more mature, they have been working for a long time, they have learned how to learn. They're very independent, highly motivated, highly driven students. And in a way, these students are so motivated, so driven, so engaged that almost anything would work for them. These are self-directed learners. So of course, the OMSCS program is adding a lot of value and a lot of structure, but this happens to be a particular slice of learners. But what about those learners who may not be as motivated or as engaged? What about those learners who are younger, who have not yet learned how to fail or how to recover from failure or how to learn from the failures that they have? I think online education has more serious challenges there. And there, that's where AI will start playing an important role. Um, that's where AI can then use data to find ways of engaging these learners, of motivating them, of providing scaffolds for them so that even the uh, less motivated learners could potentially succeed.
Okay, we have a question in the chat. Has Jill Watson been tried recently with MOOCs, where traditionally there may not be TAs or there are very few TAs and the demographic is diverse?
Good question. So yes, so in MOOCs, at very large MOOCs where you may have, say, 10,000 students or 20,000 students, no, we have not yet tried Jill Watson with that larger MOOC. The largest class that we have tried Jill Watson had about 1,000 students. And we found, well, wait a minute, we have tried it with a class which also had 1,500, machine learning for grading has about 1,500. One of the interesting findings is that as the class size increases, um, the number of questions increase, so the value added by Jill Watson increases. However, it also seems that the variety of questions that students ask also increases, not just the number. And because the variety increases and the levels of articulating a question change, there might be more grammatical mistakes, there might be more spelling mistakes, or people use different sentence structures, the morphology of sentences changes. Jill Watson can start having some trouble. That goes back to the question we were talking about robust generalizations earlier. Because we have trained Jill Watson on a particular set of materials for a particular set of demographics, assuming that questions will be of particular quality, do they really generalize towards very large classes with very different demographics and very different levels of articulation in English, for example? And what we are finding is that for large classes, even for classes as big as 1,000 or 1,500, there seems to be an upper limit to the effectiveness of Jill Watson. And we may have to think of new strategies so that Jill Watson can deal with very large classes. And that's exactly part of what we are doing in our lab right now.
Great. On education, but a little bit different than Jill Watson, someone asks, what are your views of the GitHub Copilot project, where it writes code for you and its impact on computer science education? And then they say, since it can write code for students, should it be embraced as a tool like a calculator, or should it be restricted due to its higher likelihood for unintentional plagiarism?
Yeah. Plagiarism is a problem, definitely, in online learning. But this is my own personal feeling, I'm less concerned about plagiarism because if we can help 90% of the students, even if 3% or 5% or 10% of the students are doing some plagiarism, that still seems to me to be a very useful trade-off. I would rather help as many people as I can help, even if some people are going to take advantage of it. So plagiarism is a problem, but I'm not that concerned about it. But the question raises another very important point. What is it that we should be teaching in online classes using AI or in education in general? Skills like arithmetic, algebra, geometry, now there are a large number of devices that can do that. Soon looks like there'll be like the Copilot project on GitHub, that there'll be AI technologies that might be able to write code or help someone write a code. Are these the kind of technologies we should be focusing on? Or are there other kinds of issues that we should be focusing on? For example, critical thinking. For example, social communication or creativity. So one of the things that has happened in education often is that we know, for example, that AI systems like cognitive tutors have been very successful in helping students learn things like arithmetic and algebra through deliberative practice. And yet they have not been very widely adopted. So the question becomes, why not? And I think one of the reasons is that there are many reasons, technological, cultural, economic, political, but at least one of the reasons is that um, not only does it take a lot of effort to build a cognitive tutor, upfront effort to build a cognitive tutor, but it also takes expertise to build a cognitive tutor. And it's not clear whether the expertise and the effort needed to build a cognitive tutor is really worth it, the investment, given the benefits that it gives for very well-defined problems. If the problems were less well-defined, critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, might the benefit be higher and the trade-off change?
Yeah, in my experience, plagiarism kind of has an inverse relationship with how much uniqueness the task is for the person. So, and not just literally that you have to make a different task for every person, but that when you give a task that's very difficult, and I should say also the help that you provide for the person. So the task can be difficult, but if you don't help anybody, then the ones who don't exactly know how to do it are going to feel more compelled to copy something, or they may not even feel like they're copying something, but they're looking online for things. Whereas, and that's going to happen in my experience more if you're online. If you're in the classroom, like I said, you can go to each person, kind of see what they're doing, and you can see that they're not understanding something and fix it right there. That's unique to them, kind of like a personal tutor. So I wonder if, I think you kind of were saying this, but MOOCs don't need to be simply, here's the one thing that everybody does, and there's no help because there's 15,000 of you. So we can't possibly help you individually like a tutor, but the AI can potentially. So by having the AI interact with the students in a unique way for that particular person, it seems like we can actually reduce plagiarism because there's not the motivation. They can actually get the help. And I'm sure they're there to learn, so they probably would be motivated to do that first. It's just when they don't have any options, they think, is when they resort to plagiarism. That doesn't exactly relate to GitHub Copilot, because if you're starting to type your code and it finishes your code for you, that's, like,
Yeah.
why would you deny that if it's going to work? So I don't know about that one, but just generally speaking, MOOCs and plagiarism, I think maybe AI can bring us out of that problem. You did mention creativity, so there are actually some questions about that. Well, actually, bringing a few questions together into one is basically, do you think robots or AI could be creative?
Great question. So now I can, of course, talk about the work of one of my PhD students who just graduated. Uh,
Great.
um, she examined exactly that kind of question. So she thought in terms of, her name is Jessica Fitzgerald, by the way. She's now a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon University's Robotics Institute. So she was thinking in terms of a spectrum of similarity. A new problem comes, and that new problem is either very similar to a problem that the robot has already encountered, or perhaps different. So as an example, I can have a hammer, and I can use the hammer to, a robot can use the hammer to hammer a nail in. But robot can also use the hook of the hammer to pull a mug towards itself. So now that's an example of two situations where the same tool is being used, but the tool is being used in a very different way. So that's an example of improvisation. If two problems are not very similar, and yet there is some similarity, you're using the hammer in both cases. So the question for her was, for Tesca was, how can the robot go about thinking so that it knows that it should orient the hammer in a particular pose before it can use its hook to pull something towards it, and not the flat surface of the hammer to hammer a nail in. And that's an example of sort of mundane kind of creativity, the kind of creativity that you and I do almost without thinking. It just comes to us. But how do you make a robot do that? And she was able to address that problem. I'll not get to the technical part of that solution. But yes, there is a lot of work going on these days in robot creativity. It requires a very strongly interdisciplinary effort. We have to pull in here not certainly roboticists who understand robotics, but also people from creativity and psychology literature, and also other kinds of literature. For example, other kind of communities. For example, communities like anthropology, because there are cultural factors that come into play when you're thinking about creativity. So yes, I do think that robots can and should be creative, and that's where I think the push is going in the robotics community right now.
There's a question here, a little bit long, but it's about interdependence, human-robot interaction, or interfaces. Rather than go through the details of the question, I guess, what do you see with that? Like with the robots, there's a clear, here's the robot, it's a physical thing, and we have to interact with it. We have to go together to solve a problem. But it's similar in online education and other things where there's this interaction. Do you have background in research in that kind of human-robot interaction or human-robot systems? Have you done work in that area?
A little bit. Some of my colleagues have done a lot more than I have, but for example, Teska's work was an example of work on human-robot interaction. So for example, in the problem of robot creativity, it becomes a problem in human-robot interaction because in her case, the robot tries it, fails, and then uses its knowledge about the failure to ask a human being a question. And then it learns from the kind of question that human being gives. So that's learning by correcting a mistake. But it's through robot-human interaction. But let's go back to your question again, Josh.
Oh, well, the question was about a paper in 2001, a review about autonomous human-machine systems, human-machine. In its review, the National Academies of Sciences cited the central importance of interdependence and the greater value of field validation of systems. So I'm making sure it works in the field, but noted a difficulty in determining what was interdependence and how it could be studied outside the lab. What are your thoughts on this matter? So I wasn't sure if you had an answer to that or.
Yeah, well, we can certainly discuss this. This is not an area in which I would consider myself to be an expert, but I certainly agree with the premise of discussion. Many things that work in our labs don't actually work in the field. So there is something going on in the educational sphere. So X Prize is a foundation based in LA, and they have started a new challenge program called Digital Learning Challenge. It's sponsored by Institute for Education Sciences, which is a Department of Education entity. And the reason IES has sponsored the X Prize Digital Learning Challenges along the directions that you're talking about, there is a lot of work in which people have used AI to support education, and it works in their lab or in a small controlled setting. But when they go out and try with some other researcher tries the same thing using the same technology, it doesn't often quite work the same way. So that it relates to that question that you're talking about, field testing. And so this particular challenge is, can you not only give me an AI technology that can support learning, but can you make the technology so that other people can use it in their own way so that your experimental bias is not coming in and is being field tested? And IES will give an award only if it has been field tested by a number of different researchers in their own settings. And that's when we know that there is reproducibility and replicability. So yes, that kind of field testing is very important. Goes back to the problem of robust generalizations. We test it in our small little labs with our experimental bias and controlled settings, and then we don't know whether the generalizations will occur to other settings. So,
yeah, I took a class with David Woods at Ohio State, and I'm not quoting him here, but one thing I took away from it was when you want to make a search and rescue robot and put it out in a dangerous environment, the last thing you want to do is have to figure out what happened and go rescue it. So
yeah,
you got to. The testing is difficult.
Yeah.
So I have a kind of an arc of questions that start at explainability, which I think is related to robot creativity and robots in the classroom, or online education and things like that. And inevitably, this arc will end in COVID. So we'll get to what you're looking at with COVID. But first, how important is explainability? How do we do explainability? Maybe focused on the the Jill Watson kind of example.
Well, first of all, explainability is extremely important. And explainability is important not only because the interpretability problem with deep learning, where it's not clear why some deep learning systems work. Even the researchers don't always understand why the system is quite working. So it is even for systems that use knowledge-based AI or cognitive AI or good old-fashioned AI, explainability is critically important. In a sense, there is a kind of conundrum here. The more complex is an AI system, the more there is a need for transparency, the more there is need to explain how the system works and how it produces the results it produces. So there is a larger need for transparency for explanation. On the other hand, the more complex is the system, the harder it is to explain it. I think one of the really interesting ideas that in fact has to do a little bit with layers, where you and I were both trained in that, in that lab. One of the ideas that came from our lab, but also from other labs, not the only one, was the idea that providing an agent with knowledge of its own design can be very useful. So if the agent has knowledge of its own design, usually you and I build these AI agents, and of course you and I have mental models of how the AI agent is supposed to work, otherwise we cannot build that AI agent. But we don't endow the AI agent with that model. We keep it to ourselves. So the AI agent itself has no knowledge about how it works. It just goes in and does something. But suppose in addition to building that AI agent, we also create a layer on top of it, a meta reasoning layer, where the agent has some knowledge of its own design. Then the agent can use knowledge of its own design to create explanations. So what are you doing now? How are you going to do it? What knowledge are you using? Those kind of explanations become possible. So that's one core idea that seems to be very useful.
There's definitely a tension, at least on the idea level, not necessarily people, obviously, between deep learning and what you just called, but not everything would be in this category, but good old-fashioned AI. It doesn't mean it's old; it's still there.
Yes,
but
yes.
but is there any hope for what you just described with the system knowing its own architecture and then being able to explain things with a deep learning architecture? Because it's like, so what if it knows its own architecture? There's still not much to say about what happened.
Yeah. First of all, I agree completely with your point. When I say good old-fashioned AI there's nothing old about it. It's very much alive and kicking and has a bright future to it. I agree completely. So I prefer the term knowledge-based AI or cognitive AI too. I'm not sure whether providing this kind of design knowledge is going to be very useful for explaining deep learning. Because if even the researchers don't understand exactly how the system is producing, if the representations that it is using are so inscrutable, then providing it knowledge with its own design is not going to be very helpful. So I think there are going to be limits there, but even there, maybe the design knowledge could at least say that this was the input data. Maybe it could at least say that I was using this method, even if it cannot fully explain what that method is. So it might be just partial or superficial explanations. But yes, I agree that deep learning, this problem will not solve the problem of explainability or interpretability in deep learning.
Yeah. There's an interesting question here. Back when I was a grad student, so this is the person speaking, at Georgia Tech, you described to us an experimental study in which you showed initial conditions of a neural net could radically affect the outcome of training. A quarter century later, so this student remembered 25 years later, I found myself exploiting that same principle to improve the training performance of a deep learning system by adding an evolutionary training layer over the seeds. So my question is, what subtle features or overlooked properties of our current technologies could be the potential building blocks for better intelligent systems 25 years from now?
Oh, that's a great question, a tough question. First of all, I'm so glad you remember something that you and I talked about 25 years back. So kudos to you. Certainly, the initial conditions can have a lot of effect on the performance of many deep learning architectures. And that has been a constant problem. And that problem remains even with modern deep learning systems that, for example, do image classification for ImageNet data. If you change the input image just slightly, it can give you very, very different results. So that problem has not completely disappeared. The problem very much remains. Projecting ahead 25 years is always a very risky part, and I probably will regret no matter what I say, but I'll go ahead and just sort of share some thoughts here. I think one of the things that I have recently become very interested in, and I'm increasingly persuaded that that's how things will develop, and you may not share it, uh, is that whenever we talk about, say, deep learning or knowledge-based AI, we're always talking about individual AI agents, one agent at a time that is doing some task. But as I look at human intelligence, for example, our intelligence is fundamentally social. Um, and social intelligence is something that AI has not started looking at very seriously, either in the sort of deep learning connectionist paradigm or in the sort of knowledge-based cognitive AI paradigm. Um, my sense is that the way things are going to develop over the next 25 years, some of the problems of the kind about initial conditions and their effect on deep learning will probably dissipate in their importance, because we will start thinking much more in terms of things of the kind we were talking about earlier: robot creativity, learning by imitation, learning through interaction with other humans. Robots they'll be living among us and they'll be learning by observing us, we'll be demonstrating them, we'll be correcting them. And because of that social interaction, I think some of these problems that currently look like huge problems will diminish in their importance. So I haven't answered your question because I don't have an answer to that question, but I'm changing the emphasis and the focus slightly.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting answer, that with many more robots or AI systems communicating with us and each other, new things will emerge that ultimately may be better. Now, getting to the COVID arc. So VERA, you published about recently. It's for ecological simulations. I found a video that you linked to on your website, April 2020. It was a demonstration of simulations for COVID spread. So first of all, can you explain what VERA is? But also, have you looked at those predictions from the models, and was it accurate, or is that not really the right kind of question for that model?
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking the question, and sort of kudos to you for looking at all of this material. So VERA stands for Virtual Ecological Research Assistant. Initially, we started for the domain of ecology, but over time, the E has become Experimentation Research Assistant because we have looked at several domains, COVID, for example, but also some domains in economics. So E stands for lots of different things here. There. And the basic idea is that a lot of learning is self-directed. Not all learning occurs in a pedagogical context, where in K-12 or even in college learning. Can we not build virtual labs? So when you go to a university, you have access to biology lab, chemistry labs, geology labs, and so on. In online education, you don't have access to any physical labs like that. So VERA is an example of a virtual lab. And the idea was that we should be able to create virtual labs where things are very grounded in real data, but people can conduct experiments in the abstract. They can build conceptual models. They can do evaluation by building simulations. And the AI here comes in that a user can simply build a conceptual model, and the AI behind VERA automatically sets up the simulation. Not only does it, so you don't have to be an expert in mathematical programming or stochastic process or anything, it already does that for you. And also it connects it with a very large library of biological species called Encyclopedia of Life that Smithsonian Institution has built. So you have access to large amounts of domain knowledge. So we have used this VERA also in online education in several classes, mostly in biology. And then when COVID occurred in March 2020, yes, we thought we could, it's been such a long time, yeah, difficult to keep track of it. So we thought, could we also use it for thinking about the spread of diseases? We were able to use VERA to predict the impact of social distancing on the spread of diseases. And then we didn't take it any further. So I wish we had, because COVID, of course, has become such an important thing. But there were so many interesting projects going on in the world lab. We just simply had to make choices, and I don't know whether we made the right choice or not. But there was Jill Watson, there was VERA, there was work on robot creativity going on, and we just decided that that was not the highest priority. So I don't have a good answer to that question.
Yeah, that's fair. And even though I, like everybody else, am tired of COVID, I am looking forward to all the retrospectives and analytics, because there are many models over many months and many different approaches, and people trying to use AI to read all the research papers and identify genes and stuff. And I don't know what really worked. Maybe some of that did, maybe not many things. I don't know. But hopefully, I'm sure people will study that, maybe make careers out of it. On that same question or same topic, just because some people have asked this, first in the chat, given the current landscape of computational biology around COVID, how can creative AI approaches help? And then someone asked on the forum before this day, how can we fight COVID? I don't believe you're an expert on this, but still,
yeah, no, I'm not.
I did ask.
No, I'm certainly not an expert on this at all. But I do have confidence in science, in the sense that I want to believe in data and evidence and in scientific hypotheses. And while science often gives incorrect answers, it's by no means perfect, because we don't understand all the phenomena. The data is often incomplete or incorrect. Nevertheless, I would rather go with the current scientific expertise in their answers than with the alternatives. So in that sense, I think that scientific evidence is perhaps our best tool for fighting against COVID, as I think we are trying to do. I think in terms of computational biology and creativity, that is that part of the question is certainly a lot more interesting. So let me sort of take an example. Computational biology means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I'll take an example that I'm familiar with. And I'll connect that example with climate change. So like many people, I'm sure in this audience also, I'm very concerned about climate change. So one of the kind of problems that we have been worrying about is, supposing the sea levels in Georgia, eastern Georgia, rise by a foot or a foot and a half over the next decade. What will happen to the sea turtles? They're beautiful sea turtles on the eastern coast of Georgia, as I'm sure they probably are in Florida also.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, we know as temperatures rise and the sea levels rise, then the male to female population among sea turtles changes. They almost all become females, I believe, if I have my biology correctly, and reproduction stops over time. So it's a very, very dangerous situation. Can we now start building models? And how do we go about building models of the impact of climate change on local species? Now, there are very, very good analytical models available about climate change at a global level or a regional level. There are not equally good models available, I am told, by biologists who understand these things better than I do, about the impact of things like temperature change or sea level change on local species. So there, AI can help now. For example, AI could, supposing there is a decision maker or a conservation biologist or a sea scientist who is interested in answering questions about the sea turtles, can we now use AI to fetch historical analogies about what happened to sea turtles in southern Australia, for example, where the sea turtles in southern Australia over a generation started dying because of temperature change? So that's an example where of creativity, where I'm dealing with one situation, and that reminds me of a very, very, in some sense, very similar situation, in another sense, very different situation, not Georgia anymore, but Australia. And I'm able to pull out historical trends from there that then informed what I'm currently doing, because good analytical models from a situation are not available.
Yeah, kind of transfer learning.
It's a transfer learning. So that is a kind of situation where creativity can, even small amounts of creativity can go a long way towards informing the kinds of decisions that biologists and ecologists and environmentalists are facing.
And the other thing COVID taught us is when you do need to use science to solve a problem quickly for everybody, it's very hard to do the other half of that, which is communication and explaining. And I wonder, what if AI people were put in that situation? How would we fare? Because right now, the virologists and all those are getting the heat. But if we needed to solve climate change or something quickly and they needed AI to do it, how would we do a good job at explaining to people this is what's happening? Or if robots needed to solve a task for the nation. I'm not looking forward to that situation, but maybe we can learn something from all this. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do, Josh. I think that's a very important question you're raising. So as we are work with teachers and students on online using AI in online education, many teachers are very concerned about working with us because they are concerned that if we start introducing AI in their classrooms, their jobs may vanish, or even if their jobs don't vanish, their roles may change in unprecedented way that they are not prepared to address. So we in AI community, I think, have not done a very good job of communicating about AI to the rest of the society. There are a huge amount of fears, and sometimes very reasonable fears, because there is a lack of understanding of what AI is, where it stands today. There is so much hype about AI, almost as if we're going to solve every problem, and create all kinds of dangers and risks in the process, that many people are very, very concerned. And so, in that sense, AI as a community um, could have done better and should have done better. On the other hand, things are also changing. I think many organizations, AAA included, and the show is a good example of trying to communicate something about AI. But these are sort of relatively new trends where AI researchers are beginning to take the issue of AI literacy and AI education. So not just using AI for education, but education in AI for citizen scientists, not just as sort of for computer scientists, much more seriously. And I think that's a very encouraging trend. But overall, we in AI have not done well.
It's almost like documenting your code. It's kind of the last thing you think of.
Yes, yes. Yeah, no, yeah. Everyone wants to write sexy code. Nobody wants to document it. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you describe the Squirrel AI award and how it relates to the social aspects of AI?
Yes. The Squirrel AI award was started a couple of years back, I think. Yes, 2021 was the second year, so 2020 was the first year that the award came. It came from a large company, which is called, I think, Squirrel AI, based in China, which has given a significant amount of money to AAAI, and really excellent job by AAA, especially the then President Yolanda Gill and the current President Bart Salman, in bringing in the right kind of interaction with Squirrel AI, and in using that to think about how to reward and incentivize and encourage AI research on social impact. So it has been around for 2 years. I think it could be a game changer. Um, the first one was on AI for, I think, healthcare, the first winner. And the second one was for use of AI in very large electrical power grids. I'm simplifying them. They were such a much more impressive work that then I'm making them sound here. And I think it's very encouraging that AAAI has taken that on.
Yeah, definitely. They're putting their money where
Yes,
their mouth is, I
yes,
guess. Like
yes.
people will be encouraged because of that. So we've got 11 minutes, and I want to make sure I address a couple questions that are of a different style. What is the most what's most lacking in AI education today and the undergraduate or even younger levels?
I think let's talk about two different things here. At the undergraduate and the younger level, I think there are two very different levels here. For the younger level, there is almost no education in AI going on. There's sort of very few schools in which there is anything like AI literacy going on. It used to be a generation back when we were all talking about how do we take computing to middle school and elementary school. And now a generation later, the question is how do we take AI to high schools and middle schools and elementary schools. But it's not even the K-12 issue. It's really how do we take AI to all citizens of the country and all citizens of the world. So there are 50-year-olds and 60-year-olds and 40-year-olds who do not really have much of an idea of AI, and yet they have to deal with it. So we have to educate them in what AI is and how AI can benefit them, and also the dangers and risks of AI, so that they can make informed decisions. So I think for the other levels, the big problem in AI education is that there is no AI education or very little AI education. At the undergraduate level, I think there is a slightly different problem. One problem is, should AI really should we start talking about AI in every single discipline? Or should it remain the province of computer science? So usually when we teach about AI, we teach in computer science classes. But I think that's no longer should be the case. Now I think AI should really become something that is discussed and taught in almost every discipline, because every discipline is impacted by it, or every discipline is using it. So AI should not be limited or confined to computer science. So that's certainly one problem at the undergraduate level.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I was working recently with a biologist who was counting the movement of cells over video through a microscope, and she had her students count them. And I thought, this is, I can take an ImageNet model and just train on these little circles and then track and have it all count for you. Now, obviously, there's the issue of validation. We have to make sure it's doing it correctly. But there's, many other examples, computational linguistics, physics. I mean, everybody's going to benefit somehow. But it's kind of back to that communication thing. Just because we can prove it works on your little example data set doesn't mean that's enough, that we've said everything we need to say. We need to be sure that science is being done, that we are completely clear about what this system is predicting and how accurate that is. And I know we're always thinking about that with reproducibility and explainability, but it doesn't mean it's solved. And like that COVID question, I think we would not do well if it all of a sudden was super important. The other question on this area was, how can someone, I guess two questions that are similar. How can someone pivot to doing AI in their career? And what recommendations or advice could you give to students and recent graduates in AI to keep improving their knowledge so they can advance their career?
Both are good questions. So they also relate to a theme that I'm very interested in, that has to do with the theme of lifelong learning. It used to be the case, you would go to college for 4 years or 6 years if you wanted to do your master's or even a PhD, and you were done with education, but that's no longer the case. Now education is sort of a continual process of learning. So let's deal with the first question. If you want to start learning AI in a serious way, then I would suggest really getting associated with a educational program or a research lab that is doing AI. I think that's the best way of doing that. Getting into a research lab that is doing AI research is not easy because there is enormous amount of competition. So you will probably first need to enter some educational program, learn a little bit about AI, show that you can do it, and before you join an AI research lab. Both because that's when the AI research lab will accept you, and that's when you can start making a contribution. In terms of continual learning, there are now lots of sources. In fact, I should mention AI topics in this regard. So AI topics is certainly one place. that AAAI and Joshua is a prime actor in that, where AAAI is collecting a lot of information about AI, including historical information. So there are now a large number of resources, AI topics, AI magazine, AI AAAI proceedings, where there is pretty good sources of information about AI. I would start there. So open educational resources in general is a good place to start with if you want to continue to keep in touch with AI.
Do you feel, I get this question a lot from students, that it's critical that students do like side projects in order to demonstrate competence in these areas, or can they just rely on their education? Like they've taken this course and so therefore that should be enough?
Oh, no, definitely. Doing any kind of project is very, very useful, not only for demonstrating competence, but for growth. I think when a student, all of us, we really begin to understand some material when we actually use it in some research project and delve deeper into it and explore it and even critique it. So that doing research on the side is, like you point out, I think that's why you're asking that question, and I completely agree with you. That's very, very important.
Yeah, and there are so many resources now, like just going to YouTube and searching for any topic,
Yeah.
GANs or some deep learning thing, you're going to find a bunch of videos about it. They're not necessarily all great, but I do find myself teaching and thinking, what am I doing here? If I can just play this video and you're going to get a better lecture than I can do today. But obviously there's different aspects of being in the classroom that help. But one thing I will do is actually play clips of it and then stop it and say, okay, let's explain what just happened. But it's professors in the classroom don't own everything anymore. There's a bigger world for all this stuff. And I think that's fantastic. And likewise, there's a way to put yourself out there by getting on GitHub, for example, cloning a project that you see someone else doing or following a tutorial with Torch or whatever, and making a slight variation and pushing the code up and making good documentation. And so it's not hard. It's just, it does take time. Not everybody has that kind of time to do these extra things, but there's low barrier to entry to be able to demonstrate that you have these competencies. So I guess my last question would be, in the immediate term, like this week, this month, what are you most excited about?
Really good question. So there are two ideas going on in my lab that I'll talk very, very quickly, Josh, that I'm very, very excited about. And we are writing papers on both of them right now. One is the idea of machine teaching. When you have agents like, and this connects with the question of human-robot interaction also. When you have agents like Jill Watson, it takes time to build a Jill Watson for a new class. So if it takes 50 hours to build a Jill Watson and Jill Watson saves 100 hours of answering questions, well, the trade-off is not very positive. You and I will not spend 50 hours before the semester starts in the hope that we'll save 100 hours. So we need to reduce the time to build Jill Watson from 50 hours to 5 hours, or maybe 2 hours. And so now we are experimenting with machine teaching, where any teacher, such as you and I, can go interact with Jill Watson and teach it how to answer the questions in very, very limited amount of time. Another question that we are very interested in, this connects with the question of transparency explanation, is mutual theory of mind, where humans, mutual theory of mind is the basis of human-to-human communication, but why shouldn't AI agents and humans be able to communicate with each other, with each person, each agent building a theory of each other's mind? So I don't know where we are on time, so I'm sort of running fast here. So, but those are two ideas, and we are right now writing papers on both of them. I'm very excited about it.
That's fantastic. Yeah, we can stop here because I think it's a good closing comment. So thank you everyone for watching, and obviously I'll post this recording and then everybody can tweet it out, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Great to be here. So
thank you again. See you.
Bye-bye.